My name is Alina. I work at Socio-Legal Information Center from the New Delhi office. I'm also joined by Rajiv sir from the same office and also Varsha Gumasta, who's the Assistant Director for the Center for Constitutional Rights. I welcome you all for the Disability Rights in the Law lecture series that we have been conducting. And this is the second lecture, and the lecture is on education rights of children with disabilities, and we have the most venerated Radhika ma'am with us. Before we begin, I'd like to lay a couple of ground rules. I request Radhika ma'am, the speaker, to kindly always look at the screen for the benefit of the ISL interpreter, and also to speak slowly. And anyone who will be speaking, kindly note to speak very slowly for the purpose of the closed captioning. I request everyone to remain on mute during the period of the lecture. And I also request if there are any questions to kindly DM me or put it on the chat box. The questions will be taken up by the speaker at the end of the lecture series. Thank you so much. I now hand over the mic to you, Rajiv sir, so that you may introduce the speaker.
Thank you, Alina. And good afternoon to all. On behalf of the Center of Constitutional Rights, I would like to welcome Radhika and Kazi to this disability lecture series. Radhika is well known to all of us in the disability sector. She is the founder trustee for Astha, an organization which works with children with disabilities and on community-based rehabilitation in the urban slums of Delhi. She's been in the sector for over 30 years now, and she has been a researcher documenting the discrimination vulnerable groups face at the ground level, and this information she uses for advocacy. And a large focus of her work has been on the right to education for children with disabilities. Radhika is a very, very active member of the Right to Education Forum. She's also served in various committees of the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, the Ministry of Women and Child Development, the DTIO. And she was an advisory group member to the constituted on the Asha Kiran. I don't think I will be doing justice to Radhika if I don't inform all our viewers that she's a great actor and passionate about theatre. So thank you so much. And she's also a trustee with the Socio-Legal Information Center. Radhika is going to be speaking to us on the right to education of children with disabilities. So welcome to you again, Radhika, and I'm passing over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rajiv. Can you hear me, everybody?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Rajiv and Varsha and Colin, everybody. Thank you so much for raising this issue at this point of time because of two reasons. One, we have just had our budget out. And the second reason is really that, after 2 years, it seems finally that the coronavirus is leaving us. And for the last 2 years, all of us have been responding and in it. And perhaps this and in the coming few months will be the time that we can look back and that we can start reflecting on what has happened and what has happened to the right to education of students. I want to ask many questions. There are many friends here in the audience, and I'm so happy for that. I know that there are also many lawyers, and we have many, many questions. I want to start by asking, how far has India really implemented the right to education for its students with disabilities? And I want to ask this question the way I would like to ask this question and look at this question really is, I want to look at the legal framework because that is really the base of everything. What kind of legal framework have we really made for the education rights of students with disabilities in our country? Is it a framework that really gives us the full rights? Are there discords in this framework? Is this a framework that guarantees equality and non-discrimination for students with disabilities? Then I want to look at the implementation of these laws. How have they been interpreted? I will also look very briefly at the new policy, the new education policy that India has just got. And finally, I'd like to look at what happened and what has been happening to us in the COVID-19 crisis. And with this framework in place and with all the laws in place, did we do justice to students with disabilities and to the right to education of students with disabilities in our country? I want to start with the legal and policy framework. As you know, and many people here, it will be repetition, but I'm going to repeat it nevertheless. As you know, that the disability sector and internationally has been going through a lot of change over the last 20 years. And this change has actually was given expression in 2006 by the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And this UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities really reflects a paradigm change in our thinking about the rights of people and children with disabilities. And when I say paradigm change, and I'm going to use this word quite a lot today, it really means, and we all know that really deep structural change in the way we think and in the way we act and we approach work, implementation, the rights, as well as the implementation of the rights for people and children with disabilities. So I'm just going to put out a few of the things that are there in the convention, which I think are extremely relevant and which reflect this change. The first, of course, is how do you understand disability? And as disability is seen as social and not just according, sorry, is there anybody there? Should I go ahead?
I request everyone else except the speaker to kindly remain on mute. Yes, ma'am, please.
Thank you so much. So basically, what our understanding of disability, as you know, it is no longer, the convention tells us that we are not only looking at a medical condition, but we are looking at a host of barriers that are political, social, cultural, that really come together to prevent or enable the participation of this person or the child. And the implications for education are that we cannot, as we very often hear in all discourse, even education discourse, we cannot say things like, this child cannot come to school. This child cannot cope up. This is a very Indian phrase that we all have, na? Wo to cope up hi nahi kar payega. We cannot say this child cannot learn, because because when we make statements like this, we are really putting it on the child and we are putting it on the condition that the child has, rather than looking all around and saying, did I make an effort to bring the child to school? Were the conditions conducive for this child to sit in the class? Was there support, enough support for this child to learn and to be able to cope up in a way? So that is the other thing that, I think that is very important. The other thing is disability is part of human diversity. As you know, this is one of the major principles of this convention. And the implications of this for any kind of education provisioning is that we cannot provide anything less to the student with disability. We cannot provide informal education and say it is all right. Diversity means we are all different, but we are all equal. And that is the other, the systems, when they are designed, they have to acknowledge this diversity. And that is extremely, and not draw a line between a person with disability and person who does not have a disability. The other thing that is extremely important and really the fulcrum of the change and the paradigm shift that we are talking about today is legal capacity, equal recognition before the law. Article 12 of the Convention talks about equal recognition before the law. This is extremely important in education because very often, as we all know, right in the beginning, right when there is a child, very young child, we give up. We give up because somewhere at the back of our minds is the thinking, and the back of society's mind, there is a thinking that this child is not going to grow up to be a person who can take their own decisions in life, contribute to a society, and therefore, why is it important? It's not important to invest in this child. Therefore, having this whole, the Article 12, which talks about legal capacity for people with disabilities, particularly for people with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities, is extremely important. Alongside, and that is why also that one of the principles of the convention is the evolving capacities of children. Because again, it is often seen that children, we often give up and we say, when a child has high support needs, it is often thought that this child cannot go forward. So there is no need to really look at this child. The other major area is the whole idea of equality and non-discrimination. And the convention tells us very clearly that equality does not mean that everything is the same. You have to provide reasonable accommodation. You have to provide individualized support. And if we want people to be equal, and if we do not provide it, then that is discrimination. Article 24 talks about education. And one of the things this article says, amongst many other things, I won't go into all the details, is that state parties must ensure the realization of the right of persons with disabilities to education through an inclusive education systems at all levels. And I think inclusive education systems is the operative word. It is the important word because we are talking of systems here. We are talking about the whole education system. So inclusive education is not a program. It is not something that is isolated. It is the system. The convention also provides, and in line with what I had spoken about the evolving capacities of children and legal capacity, it promises lifelong education. Therefore, it is very important when we look at education rights of students with disabilities that we look at the sites of education, that we look to see whether there are education go from one level of education to another. That is extremely important. And along with that, the convention in the article also talks about not excluding students with disabilities, the idea of reasonable accommodation for individual requirements, and the idea of supports that are extremely important, and that these supports are given within the general education system for the child. In 2007, there are of course many other areas, but I will just talk about this much. So India was one of the first countries to ratify this convention. So 2007, I think we ratified the convention. In 2009, we have the Right of Children to Free and Compulsory Education Act, the RTE Act. As you know, the whole discussion for the RTE Act was going on simultaneously for many, many years. And many of us were following that discussion. As you know, the RTE Act is the implementation of the fundamental right to education of children between the ages of 6 to 14. It is India's attempt to universalize education for all children. This means that the law is for all children, including students with disabilities and including students with high support needs. Now, this law also was a paradigm shift in the way we transacted education. There were many things in the RTE Act that can constitute a paradigm shift. The first of these was the law attempted to formalize education. As you know, before this law came in, there were many situations where there was a whole lot of alternative education, informal education sites, particularly for students who were marginalized, and students with disabilities were part of these. So in a way, this law really defines for us for the first time in India, what is a school? Because a school can mean so many different things. In the schedule of the RTE Act, you have a whole lot of things that we must do if we are to be seen as a school. Some of these things are having playgrounds, libraries, toilets, drinking water facilities, having classrooms there for all students, having barrier-free access. Of course, it doesn't say what barrier-free access means, but that term is certainly there. And PTRs of 30:1, that means, and all these things are very enabling for students with disabilities. Because when you have a boundary wall, you have all the things that are important for education. A PTR of 30:1, a student, a teacher can focus on all the students and support the student with disability along. It is much easier for the teacher to do that than when she is teaching a class of 100 students. She can give individualized attention to all the students, which is very, very important for all students with disabilities and about everybody. The RTE also talks about having trained teachers. As you know, in many of our states, we have not had, firstly, we've had a shortage of teachers, which continues. We also do not have trained teachers. A trained teacher is extremely important for students with disabilities because then they know actually how to teach well. Child-centered education and continuous and comprehensive evaluation is another cornerstone of the RTE Act. Here, the law talks about a curriculum that enables both the physical as well as the mental development of the child. And that is extremely important for students with disabilities because you're not only looking at education in a very narrow way. You're talking about the whole child, and the way we looked at it when the RTE Act came in, we said maybe this is an opportunity for many of our students in other areas to get that support within the school system if we are talking about full, the whole child and education. The other thing was the whole idea, the commitment to provide all teaching and learning materials and continuous and comprehensive evaluation. This was a clause, I think, that was before its time in our country, but would have been extremely important for students with disabilities because when you are looking at comprehensive evaluation, you are not looking at only the 3 R's and not taking a decision on that, but many of our students have abilities in so many different areas. It is not necessary that you always have to read and write. And I think that is the other thing that was extremely important. Continuous evaluation. So you're not only evaluating students when there is an exam, but also evaluating constantly, and so many different aspects of the child get evaluated. However, this is a clause that was rescinded because we just could not implement it. And the implications are also for education is that then the education system provides a much wider range of opportunities to the student, which is very enabling for all students, including students with disabilities. There is a recognition in the law, very important, of disadvantage and vulnerability. I have not seen many laws that recognize disadvantage, vulnerability, in the way the RTE Act has recognized, and many students have been recognized here. There are strong non-discrimination clauses that are also there. there is the whole area of accessibility. The law actually gives us, that a distance that student can need only to travel 1 kilometer if they are to reach a primary school. So this helps the student not to have to go for a long way to come to a school. As you know, for many of our students, this is the biggest barrier just to get to the school. So having to travel a smaller area, smaller space is much easier. The other important areas that are important for students with disabilities, of course, they're important for all, but I'm only pointing out for students with disabilities today, is parents and communities are important stakeholders in this law. There is the school management committee, which is a committee that actually monitors the school and looks at enrollment, retention, and completion of education of all students. And if you look at the rule of this law, then the SMC has been given specific responsibility for the enrollment, retention, and completion of school for students with disabilities also. There is a clear responsibility, and that is very important, of the state, because we're talking about compulsory education. This is the responsibility of the state to provide all these things. So, but apart from that, with children with disabilities, this law has a very, what should I say? It's a very kind of wishy-washy connection. Why do I say this? I say this because there's section 3 in the law. After all this, that could have been very beneficial if interpreted well for students with disabilities, the law goes on to say in section 3 that children suffering from disability have the right to education under the Persons of Disabilities Act 1995. Now, this is interesting because, we have already ratified the UN Convention. We know that our laws are going to change. The 1995 Act is not in consonance with the UNCRPD. Yet in 2009, when the law comes for the fundamental right to education of our children of this country, we still reference the 1995 law. That law, as per its own time when it was enacted, gives us a whole plethora of options. You can go to the general school, the special school, CBR, so many different ways, and it is, sites for education, and it is not strong on inclusive education, as was the thinking at that point of time. So in many policies at that point of time, we used to hear about this basket of options that should be there for students with disabilities. And then, but what did happen when the RTE Act came in was that we all saw that although they had talked about disadvantaged students, students with disabilities were not talked about. So the disability sector went onto the streets. And in 2012, we had an amendment, which was, where children with disabilities were added to the disadvantaged groups. But along with that, we had another clause that children with severe and multiple disabilities were given the right and the choice for home-based education, what is called home-based education, under this law. Yeah, so, but this law gave home-based education, but after writing this one word, one sentence, there was nothing else in the law that spoke about what is home-based education. The rules of the law never changed to include home-based education or to give us an idea of how this should be transacted. So it remained that one sentence in the RTE Act, and it remains like that till this day. This law did not address the special school. There was a special categories of school in the law, but the special school is not at all talked about. So big omission there of one side of education that many students with disabilities were using and continue to use at this point of time in our country. That again is surprising because this is the law, and we keep repeating it, for the fundamental right of all children. There was this whole thing about, transport, but not a very strong commitment for students. And as I've said already, the SMCs had the responsibility for students with disabilities. Now, 12 years down the road of the RTE Act of the Fundamental Right to Education, what did we see today? As part of the RTE forum, we have been looking at this law and the implementation of this law every year. Every year reports have been coming out, and alongside stock-taking reports of the forum, we bring out a small report on disability in as many years as we have been able to do it. At present, only 12% of our schools are RTE compliant in the country. In the recent budget, the finance minister hardly talked about the RTE. Somebody said there was no mention of the RTE. I'm not sure, but much depends on how we interpret the law. And the interpretation of the law could have been very wide to include all students with disabilities. But indeed, it became very narrow because actually the scheme that was there to implement the law, that is your Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, did not really change much. So we had this wonderful law, but actually in the implementation, not much changed. And terms such as barrier-free access were finally interpreted as very narrowly as ramp and rail. And this has been a big learning for those of us who have been following this law, that you can have a law which says many things, but when it is actually interpreted and implemented, it can become very, very narrow, and we have to guard against that. Many things changed. The law has been amended at least 3 times since in the last 12 years. Continuous and comprehensive assessment was taken away. Exams are back. The other things that have been happening was in the area of education is we have seen a lot of privatization happening, many small private schools coming up that do not comply with the RTE. We have seen in many states a rationalization of schools, shutting of government schools, and a merging of schools that has been happening in state after state, because with often the reason that there are hardly any students coming to a school. Now, the implications of this for accessibility, we can all understand. If a child has been walking 1 kilometer, in our country, most children walk, and coming to a school, and then the school is merged and sent somewhere else, then many children, including students with disabilities, have had to drop out because of this. We did a small study and looked at this actually some years ago when this whole thing started, and we found in Rajasthan, in Jaipur, many students had dropped out. There was a big push to extend the RTE to early childhood. A lot was done. The ECCD Alliance worked with Dr. Amita Dhanda, and we were very hopeful that the RTE will be extended downwards as well as upwards. But although there was a lot of discussion, and there was finally that did not happen. So there is a commitment in the RTE for early childhood, but it's not a strong commitment at all. The school management committees did not become strong. And where in state after state, if you looked at the training that the school management committees got, that did not include disability at all. So we had this wonderful, strong legal, a committee that was legally powerful, but that committee could not become strong and could not take on behalf of the right to education of students with disabilities. Home-based education. It is very interesting, but all government reports, we do not see anything on home-based education. We do not, the UDICE did not report on home-based education. There were a few studies done by individual NGOs, and these studies, the Fourth Way Foundation, Seva in Action, then a white paper was done by the Equals for Vidyasagar in Chennai, and that looked at home-based education. And in all these studies, the two things that come out again and again are that students who were being put in home-based education were not students, were students who could easily have come to school. That was one. The other thing was that everybody, all the students as well as the parents, wanted the child to come to school. And that it was more often than not a choice as the law had said it would be. It was the decision that the state took, which child should go into home-based education and which child should not. Now, this is a question in my mind. Do we really accept this for our children? Because the way this option has been used is really not an option where teachers come in every day to teach a child. It is once in a blue moon, once in 10 days, once in 15 days. In different states, there were different people who came to teach the child. In some states, it was a caregiver, not even a teacher. And that, I think, is a question that we must ask ourselves. Does this lead to an equal right to education for this student with disabilities? Alongside this, today, 2 years into the pandemic, all our students have been in home-based education. We have reports of learning loss. We have reports of mental health difficulties of our students. And I want to ask this question today of this audience. Did we suppose that students with disabilities, as the law said, severe and multiple disabilities, would be able to learn, would not have learning loss, would not be isolated, would not have mental health issues if they were left in home, like all our students have been left at home today? So that's a question for everybody here. How is this an expression of the fundamental right to education is something we need to ask ourselves. So I think the question is really, is it a reflection of the society and the way we were thinking at that point of time? And have we really changed? Have we really gone forward in our thinking? Yeah. The other thing that I'd like to talk about then is, the RPWD Act, as you all know, and history of the RPWD Act starts in 2010. And so 2009 we get RTE, 2010, the work for RPWD Act begins. And the work begins in, the question that is raised is, do we need an amendment of the earlier act, or do we need a new act? As you all will remember, the disability sector was discussing it, fighting over it. Many things happened, and we decided that we needed that paradigm shift to be reflected in our law. We did not want the earlier law to just be tampered with and put across, but because we had ratified the CRPD, we wanted a new law. And a new law is what we got. In its final form, the RPWD Act is actually, many parts of it are just right from the UNCRPD. And this law is a paradigm shift in itself. It brings a different vision of education for students with disability. So we have now 2 paradigm shifts that are happening in our country. It brings in many new concepts many new concepts that now have to become common parlance in education circles. And I think that's one thing that we have to work with. For example, it brings up the whole idea of persons, the definition of persons with disabilities, very much like the UNCRPD. It brings out definition of reasonable accommodation, a much wider definition of communication where all different forms of communication are accepted. Accessibility. It brings the concept of high support needs, not severe, but high support needs. And then it brings out the concept of benchmark disabilities. For example, benchmark disabilities are students who, or people who have that 40% or more. So it brings out this concept also. So many new concepts. The concept of universal design is there. And 21 impairment groups are now part of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act 2016 when it comes to us. The big thing in education here is it defines for us for the first time in our country, what is inclusive education? And once again, it talks about a system of education. It is a system of education where students with disabilities and students without disabilities can work together, and that this learning is suitably adapted to meet the needs and learning needs of different types of students with disabilities. Yeah. Then, of course, it kind of, I think we were worried. We've given out too much, because then immediately the law goes on to say that the government must endeavor, and all education institutions will provide inclusive education to students with disabilities, and the local authorities shall endeavor. Then there, of course, as you know, this law deals with every aspect of education. And it is really a paradigm shift. It talks about reasonable accommodation. It talks about providing individualized support. It talks about a modified curriculum and examination system. It recognizes that students communicate in diverse ways, and that therefore, curriculum and materials need to be available for people who communicate in different ways. It talks about resource centers. It talks about teachers with disabilities and the training of teachers and teachers training institutions. Teachers with disabilities is extremely important because, as we know, they are the best to teach other students with disabilities as well as other students in general. There is a much wider understanding of accessibility. And if you look not only at the sections that are there on education, there are other sections of the law that enable education, like section 40 to 45 that talk about strong sections on accessibility, that talk about the school. And the one thing that this law does then is that it acknowledges the special school. It says, notwithstanding anything said in the RTE Act, the student with benchmark disability will have the right to study and the choice to study in a special school. But once again, just like home-based education, it's very interesting, but there's nothing more. We don't have an idea of what the special school is here. We have nothing more on special schools in this law. So it's very interesting. You have all these different sites of education for students with disabilities, but you don't have really an understanding of what is home-based education and what is special school. It's not clear that that there are any standards that these schools have to follow, because they're not there in the RTE either. Then we have the policy that comes into in 2020. And the policy is another paradigm shift. I'm saying this again and again because I want to draw your attention to the fact that somewhere there is a need for us to bring the coherence of all these things together if we are really to talk about a framework for the right to education of students with disabilities. And I'm seeing pieces here and there, but I'm not seeing a coherent framework. The policy, as you know, is another paradigm. It just changes the way education is transacted again. And I remember hearing an educationist who spoke at that point of time, and he said, once again, before the RTE has had time to settle in, we've changed the way education is to be transacted again. How many years is it going to take for us to now get into a new system, just as we were getting into the RTE system? Anyway, this law gives a lot of focus to the RPWD Act. It has a lot to say about students with disabilities, the policy, and that is very good. But on the other hand, it does not say much about the RTE Act. In fact, it actually dilutes the RTE Act in many different ways. And that is, again, a point that we need to worry about. It brings in early childhood as a very important area for consideration, which is very good because that is what provides the head start. So now our children will be coming into school at the age of 3. And Anganwadis become another site, and pre-primary become another site for formal education of children, including children and students with disabilities. It brings in another term, the socially and economically disadvantaged children, and disability is part of that. So there is disadvantaged and EWS in the RTE, and we have socially and economically disadvantaged groups in the policy. There is a big push here that, special education zones should be there, where there are many, many such students there. Many new bodies in this policy are there. New bodies for assessment, for standard setting, for online education, and technology is given a lot of primacy. The open school is another site of education, and the open school is given a lot of primacy in the policy, particularly for students who are socially and economically disadvantaged. According to this policy, there are going to be all new curriculum frameworks, and that we are going to have a mission on foundational literacy, a mission mode, and numeracy in our country, which is early. There are new ways of governance that are now coming up. That is the school complex that is coming up. It says a lot about teachers and teachers training, but doesn't say much about the resource teachers or the special educators. So once again, it's a little unclear, although it talks about the RPWD Act. It's unclear how all of this is going to happen. Once again, there is no mention of the special school. So again, I think this, this is a national policy for education for all children in our country. So why do we not talk about the special school? There is a big push here on home-based education. The policy says it will audit home-based education and that it will come up with rules. And then I want to point out, just go back 2 steps and point out a little bit of the history of this policy. When the first edition of this policy came, as we all know, there was very little on disability. And it was, whatever was there was totally against the UNCRPD. And that was that 400-page document that we all read at that point of time. So it's very interesting. Then the disability sector took on and many people wrote to the policy makers. And now we have this policy. But it tells us that at every point when policies or laws are made, it is extremely important that people with disabilities and their organizations are present. Otherwise, if we did not respond, we would have had a policy with very little on disability. But if you look at the law and you look at the 2 laws, they don't reference each other. If I want to go back to the RTE and the RPWD Act and say, okay, we have this policy, but the law has primacy over policy, doesn't it? But if I look at those two laws, they don't reference each other. They don't form a coherent framework for the right to education of students with disabilities. There are many gray areas. For example, there is the home-based education. The RPWD doesn't talk about it. There is special school in the RPWD, the RTE doesn't talk about it. We still have terms like severe and multiple disabilities, which are no longer there in the RPWD Act because everything has changed and the laws have not been amended. The disability laws themselves, all the other laws of the disability sector are not in harmony. The National Trust Act, the Rehabilitation Council of India Act, which actually looks at all the teachers and teachers training, which is extremely important for education rights, have not been reworked at all. There have been some efforts. So there is, but they have not. So what I'm trying to say here is, so in the disability arena, we don't have a framework at this point of time, which is coherent. And in the education arena either, we don't seem to have that framework. And because we don't have that framework, there are many areas. The relationship, the role of the resource teacher in for the student with disability or for other students. I would like to say here, so many of these questions we've just not sorted out, and these questions have been there for a long, long time. What I'd really like to say here is, if we think of the RPWD Act, and we really think of all the changes it is demanding in the system, they are profound changes. They are not changes that can happen just in isolation. So they cannot happen in parallel either. For example, the way we have implemented right to education for students with disabilities and Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, Samagra Shiksha Abhiyan, it has been a kind of a parallel stream. But you cannot make profound paradigm shift changes without looking at the whole system. And I think that is one of the things that we need to think about. And we are asking a system that does not prioritize the individual. That is a chalk and talk system to now provide individualized support, to provide reasonable accommodation. So unless everything changes down to the rules and regulations, we are not going to get a big change in the way or an implementation or a wide enough interpretation of the RPWD Act and the right to education that is reflected in this law. I also feel, and I want to put this today to you, that we must ask the question the other way also today. We in the disability sector must look at some of the concepts that are there in our laws and ask, do they apply to other children also? For example, the concept of reasonable accommodation. At ASTA, we've been doing a study where we've been looking at students who have chronic illnesses such as cancer, who require a lot of medical intervention, and students with disabilities such as students with thalassemia who also require a lot of medical intervention. And when we look at these students, children with encephalitis, when we look at these students, we find that there are many areas where students, the needs are the same. A child who is living with cancer is also a child who can face many cognitive difficulties, psychological difficulties, who will miss school like other students will, like the student with thalassemia will, when they have to go for their blood transfusion, like this child will when they have to go for their chemo. So the question really is that many of the concepts that we have that in the RPWD Act today may be relevant for many other students. And if we are to look at systemic change, we need to look at this very carefully. because we need a broader consensus. The whole concept, for example, of communication, the different ways of communicating. Just take the example of audio. We have audio books. They could be relevant for so many students across the board. And similarly, other ways of communicating that other students with disabilities have, they need to become part of the whole system rather than separate, because if they remain separate, I don't think they're really going to be implemented in there, and they could benefit a whole host of students. So I think, I mean, just look at the way the whole concept of inclusive education has come from disability, but widened over the years to look at, you know, all children who are vulnerable. Inclusive education is no longer just education of students with disabilities in the system, but all children. So along with that, I think I'm taking up a lot of time, so I'm just going to go a little faster. How do we do this? We need to converse with the larger systems. We need to be part of the larger education systems and the discourse in that. And the larger education systems need to understand what this law and what are these concepts, and we need to see how they kind of work together if we are really to have a framework that works together. At an implementation, as you know, we have so many sites of education now for students with disabilities. But the question we need to ask for each one of these, that is home-based education, the special school, the open school system, the general school system, is really the early childhood education system is, can the student with disability move from one system to another? Can she move from home-based education to the general school or the special school if she wants to? Are we providing equitable resources as well as teachers, trained teachers and curriculums to all these sites of education? Can the student with disability who is in a special school or in home-based education, can they go on to the next level, the next level and next level and on to college? These are the questions we have to ask if we are talking about the right to education of students with disabilities. What the data tells us is that even with the laws that have been there, the participation of students with disabilities continues to be extremely low. It is persistently low and it has been falling. If you look at the white paper that we have just done for NCP-EDP, you will see the data in great detail, so I won't go into it a lot here. Suffice it to say that not only is it falling, the enrollment of students with disabilities, but the big thing is that when students with disabilities come to secondary education, there is a huge fall in enrollment, like more than half the students have opted out already. And that tells us something about the implementation of the laws, really. The other thing that is a little startling in data, and UDICE has this thing, is that the percentage of schools in our country that actually have students with disabilities is dismal. It is 29.47% of schools in our country have students with disabilities. I still can't believe it. If you look at the state-wise data there, you will find that states like Kerala may have 60%, but then there's states like Bihar that have 29.47% of the schools who have students with disabilities. So that's another thing to really look at. These sharp drops are extremely worrying. So really you have students with disabilities in the elementary, primary, upper primary. We have no idea how many students with disabilities are there in early childhood systems, Anganwadis. As you know, we are traditionally excluded from these systems, have been. And when you go into secondary education, there's a sharp drop. And this drop is much more than other vulnerable groups, for example, tribal children or children from the scheduled castes also. And this is there in the policy document. Finally, when you look at data on the special schools, you find also a similar thing. So, and what we also find that even though there is a growth in the numbers of students in special schools in the country, they're so uneven, and they are hardly 1 point something of all the schools in the country. They're unevenly spread across the country. So when a law says that a student has a right to education, we still don't have a blueprint of actually how many special schools are going to be there in this country. What are the standards that they are going to work by? What are as you know, many of them also run informally. So what are those boards of education that they are going to be attached to? Those that have run informally till now. Of the many barriers in implementation, the crux of the matter for me is that finally the system does not take responsibility for this child. The responsibility for education of students with disability falls on the student and on the parent in our country. If you look again and again, and I've looked at it for many years, and I have many colleagues here who would bear me out here, when a student goes into the school, very little is actually changed for that student. We are conducting a study in Bihar just now, looking at what is happening with students with disabilities during the Corona time. And what we are finding is very similar to what we found in studies for so many years, that any student who can actually, what they say, cope up or race with the other students in the class is there, manage somehow, even if maybe humiliated, manage somehow, that student is there regularly in school. But the moment there are support needs, we find that students are highly irregular and that they are very often dropping out. In Bihar, we also see that, they are often given cash transfers for books. In the Corona time, there have been no books and really no reaching out to students with disabilities with online education. So you have had students with disabilities without any education for 2 years. And as all reports are telling us today, the ASAR report, for example, which is the most respected report of, tells us that there is a stark digital divide in our country. And it also says, for example, give me a minute, that teachers are saying 65% of the teachers in the ASAR report said flagged the problem of children being unable to catch up as one of their biggest challenges, that their learning outcomes are highly affected unless addressed with urgency. The National Achievement Survey also talks about how children in the primary grades have struggled to make sense of questions, to test basic comprehension and numerical skills. Now, although these reports do not talk about students with disabilities, but we can extrapolate from here. If this is the state, then what do you think the state of the student with disability will be? Finally, I'd like to say we started with the budget. And the budget tells us if we are going to get a real push in the right to education of students with disabilities or not. The budget has a lot of focus, as we had thought, on this one class, one channel, a lot on technology, online education in hybrid modes. There's an online university, but the money for the national scheme of incentive to girls, the scholarship of students with disabilities, other marginalized groups has been discontinued. There is no talk of the gender inclusion fund that is there said in the policy that there will be. The schemes for the students belonging to the minorities has also been, has seen a big cut. So with this, I would like to ask this audience today, on a scale of 1 to 10, where would we put the right to education of our students. And in the end, I'd just like to say that, you know, the whole idea of diversity, if all over the world, we are seeing a narrowing of this idea, including in our country, we cannot think that students with disabilities will be part of that diversity if the whole concept is narrowing down. With that, I'd like to end. Thank you very much.
What Radhika ma'am is what we have question. So I will be changing the settings now.
Sorry. I can't hear you. Can you hear me? I'm sorry, I cannot hear anything. Can you hear me? You cannot hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Okay. I'm waiting for the question or a discussion. Thank you, Panandi.
Hello, hi. Radhika ma'am, I'm extremely sorry. There was a
That's okay.
glitch. Bulbul has somebody named Bulbul has a question. So we have changed the settings. So I request Bulbul to kindly, you may speak the question. You may ask it directly, Bulbul. He is requested for the same. So it seems that he may not be available. So the question is, why doesn't JBT, like teaching courses, not taught how to deal with the CWSN student?
Why
does in JBT, like teaching courses, not taught how to deal with a CWSN student?
I think one of the reasons is that, you know, traditionally there has been such an exclusion from education that despite the fact that, you know, there has been a lot of advocacy that all teachers should know how to work with all students. We have still not reached that stage. In our teachers training courses, there has to be a big change there. Until and unless that change is there, we are not going to find that most of our general teachers have an understanding of how to work with students with disabilities. And of course, yeah, I think it is the exclusion that has happened for so many years. These are all the areas and the way we have organized it. So we have the specialist teacher, the resource teacher, who is trained by the RCI. And so therefore many, you know, so therefore in the system, it is thought that it is this teacher who will teach this child. And the responsibility of teaching the child is not necessarily that of the general teacher. That is why we often hear people saying, "Aapka teacher nahi aaya, isliye aap aaj school mat aao."
Thank you so much, ma'am. We have a little bit more time, so if anyone wishes to ask any question, please do so right now in the comment. I
Or
can
maybe comment.
Yes.
A comment would be good also. Somebody who agrees, disagrees, or
Nice comment from Akhil Paul, if I may read out loud. He says, excellent presentation, Radhika ma'am. Inclusive education is the buzzword, so the disability sector must engage the mainstream education sector in a big way. Can you please give us some tips?
okay. So some of the tips could be, let's join the RTE forum. No, that is one, but I think we must sit down. I think what is urgent for us to do is perhaps sit down with educationists and have a series of meetings, and lawyers, HRLN, there's the Vidhi Center, so many people who work on education and with a focus on students with disabilities and others, and really sit down and look at where is the accord and where is the discord in the framework, and try and sort it out. And that, I think, is going to be a process, but we must start engaging in it. And we as Akhil, in yesterday's webinar, it was also said, there was a webinar that Akhil was, the master of ceremonies in, and on poverty and hunger and disability. And as Jean Dresse said, economics, the poverty of economics is that it does not talk about disability. And so we have to engage with the larger sectors.
Thank you so much, Radhika ma'am. I really hope we can all sit down one day and then talk more about it. It was a great lecture. I'm sure everyone completely agrees with me when I tell you that this has been one of the most informational, especially in terms of knowing more about where the law stands. And it is quite disheartening to see that the legislation so far hasn't spoken more about in terms of the rights of the disabled children and their education, even though there has been multiple attempts to make education more inclusive. So I really, yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to say one thing, was that yes, the RTE does not reference the RPWD Act, like it referenced the earlier act. And I wanted to ask the lawyers here, does it just happen automatically that we have a new law? So the RTE Act, which used to reference the earlier law, would now reference the RPWD Act? This is my question to the lawyers.
Are there any lawyers who would like to answer that question? I personally would like to take that as a challenge and look into it and let you know, Radhika ma'am.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone. This has been great. If Radhika ma'am, if you could provide us with the email ID, or you can send, you may approach the HRLN with any questions that you may have pending. We will connect you with the resource person, and we will try and have all of the questions answered in the next couple of days. Thank you so much. Have a nice day. Have a nice day, Radhika ma'am.
Thank you.
मेरे को